Hello, everybody, and welcome to this fifth long COVID plus conversation. I know that some of you have joined us for most or maybe even all of the conversations, so that's great to see. I'm very excited about today's meeting. We will have a presentation by Femke van Hout, whom I will introduce in a second. After that, there will be room for questions to Femke and also discussion. So I really look forward to hearing Femke, but also hearing all of you. Femke van Hout is a PhD student at Tilburg University, and she told me that her research is about chronic pain, and she's using very interdisciplinary methods that include philosophical research, but also ethnographic research. And much of her work also focuses on time and the experience of time, and that is what she's going to be speaking about today to us. So Femke, please share your screen and give it away.
Thank you so much. Okay, 1 second. Let's see. Yes, can you hear me okay? And you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much for this introduction, Eva. I'm very happy to speak here today, so thank you for inviting me. So as Eva told you, I am focusing in my research on chronic pain, but also a bit more on chronic illness in general and how that can influence your experience of your past and your present and your future self. And today I want to talk with you about a phrase that kind of, I think some people present with long COVID or other conditions might have heard from their doctors or peers, which is that you just have to learn to live with it. And I want to start with a newspaper article from the NOS from March 2024, when the Dutch Public Health Council stated that fibromyalgia should be recognized as a real disease that causes chronic pain. So by the Dutch government. So the Dutch government should recognize this disease. And fibromyalgia causes muscle pain, a lot of fatigue, but since there is not one clear physical cause, many people with this disease struggle to find any financial support or to get any proper medical care, and are often severely misunderstood by the people around them. So it was quite a big deal that the Health Council stated, well, we should actually recognize this. And the director of Reuma Nederland reacted, well, for too long, people have been told that they just have to learn to live with it. And I was very interested by this phrase, actually, because you just have to learn to live with it is seen as one of the most terrible things you can hear from your doctor. And why is this sentence so problematic? Because in a way, you could argue that it is the human condition that we have to live with the situation we find ourselves in. So, the place you're born, the body you have, or the illnesses you get along the way. I mean, you can try to change the situation or to meaningfully relate to it, but you can never really detach yourself from it. In some way, you have to deal with it or live with it. And secondly, it can also be a relief to no longer constantly look for one specific cure or diagnosis. So just to give my own experience as an example, I've been having chronic pain for around 10 years now. And for me, it has been quite a relief to no longer look for this one specific moment in which the pain will change or be solved, but to actually see how on a sort of daily basis I can deal with it with the people around me. But what I want to argue today is that you just have to learn to live with it is very problematic because of the specific context in which it is uttered. And firstly, it is often kind of framed as an individual task. So it's often the case that doctors or peers are like, well, we don't really know what to do. You go and try to learn to live with it by yourself, basically. Secondly, interestingly, this phrase is mostly used in the case of chronic situations. So when you, for instance, have cancer, but the doctor sees quite a lot of possibilities for treatment, they won't tell you, well, you just have to learn to live with it. But when you're officially cured and then you are still suffering from chronic fatigue, then the doctor might tell you, well, we don't know what to do, learn and live with it. So, and the meaning of the chronic is very interesting because in medical context, it mostly means that a disease lasts for 3 months, 6 months, or longer than the expected time. So it just lasts for a long time. But in our culture, we really associate the chronic with something that just doesn't end, something that is hopeless, and with a sort of lack of possibilities for meaningful life. And there are quite some interview studies that have pointed out that being diagnosed with a chronic disease can influence the way in which people relate to their own future. And I was specifically moved by this quote from this interview study. It was by a 58-year-old man who had been suffering from chronic pain for 5 years. And he said, "My future is black. The pain does not go away, and I've been told that nothing can be done for me." And what I want to argue is that these feelings of hopelessness and isolation, they're not necessarily inherent to chronic illness or long-term illness, but intertwined with the way in which we view, talk about, and treat chronic illness in our society. And I have a few questions I want to ask. The first one is that I want to basically question, okay, what do we actually mean when we say something is chronic? When do we use this term? And where does it come from? So I will go into the history of the concept of chronic and the history of the concept of chronic disease. And what I will try to show is that in our culture, chronic basically functions as the opposite of progressive time. So the opposite of time that actually goes somewhere, that goes towards a sort of endpoint, and that we associate with hopefulness, with making life better. And that the chronic is the other side of that, something which is non-progressive, which is stagnant, and therefore is associated with some kind of hopelessness. And secondly, I want to question how being diagnosed with a disease as chronic might influence these experience of hopelessness and isolation. And lastly, I want to question, are there maybe alternative ways of looking at time and chronic illness? And might those open new ways or other ways of living with a long-term illness? So I hope you guys can see this, and the heads are not in front of it, but I think many of you know that the word chronic comes from Greek, so chronos, and which basically meant time as quantitatively measurable duration. So basically time that can be measured by the clock. And in her book, Beside You in Time, the philosopher Elizabeth Freeman shows how this meaning of this word chronic has changed over time. And she says that, well, until about 1600, chronic could mean that something lasted for a long time, but it could also mean that something was off time or about time. So it just was applied to things that had to do with time. But that's changed, she says, in modernity. So then the meaning became that it's something that goes on for a long time and that is bad. So it's something ongoingly bad. And she said something that I never really thought about, is that we talk about things like chronic pain, chronic poverty, chronic depression, but we don't really talk about something chronic in a positive sense. We don't say, well, that guy is chronically happy. And if we say that, it means that it's probably a pathological situation. So it always means that there is a situation that is ongoing, but that it is bad that it is ongoing in that way. And now I will go to the history of chronic disease specifically. So, you know, the concept of chronic disease has basically existed since ancient times, but it has only been quite recently that we've made these really big categories of like either a disease is acute or a disease is chronic. So that we really categorize diseases this way has only started really in the 20th century. And it is often assumed that this increase in attention for chronic diseases came because less and less people were dying of infectious diseases. There was just better medicine. And because less people were dying from acute diseases, this automatically shifted attention to chronic diseases. And you can add to that that nowadays we get older, and many diseases that used to kill you in the past are now made chronic by modern medicine. So you, for instance, certain types of cancer. So the idea is like, okay, things that would we are just more confronted with chronic diseases, so to say, and this is why we have such a focus on it. But in chronic disease in the 20th century, the book I show here, historian George Wise says, well, I'm not really happy with that explanation because it doesn't explain why we basically group all these different kinds of disease with different kinds of etiologies under this one umbrella term of chronic disease. And he starts tracing the history of the term, and he shows that, well, chronic disease is actually an American policy construct. It served as a powerful category for reorganizing health policies. So he shows that around the 1920s in America, there were many people who wanted to reorganize the healthcare system, but it was very difficult to argue for that because there were less and less people dying of infectious diseases. And White shows that around that time, a new statistical category was invented. So a new way of basically recording illnesses. And it was the days of illness. So it was argued that, okay, we should not only look at mortality, so how many people are dying of a disease, but we should look at morbidity, so the amount of time that people are actually unable to provide for themselves. And with this, they were able to show, like, wait, there is actually a big problem. Because even if less people are dying, there's a lot of people being ill for a really long period of time. And that's why we need reform. So this started in the United States, and also with the advent of like these international health organizations, this also was transferred to Western Europe. And nowadays, chronic disease is basically listed by the World Health Organization as the number one threat to people's well-being and the number one death threat overall. And Wise basically shows that this interest with chronic disease has very much been linked to economic goals. So making healthcare more efficient, getting people back to work as soon as possible, or getting the chronics out of the hospital and make more space for people who are acutely ill and can be cured more easily. And this specific economic way of looking at health, or at medicine, or at the body is linked, I think, to a specific idea of time, which we could call the modern idea of time. So around modernity, the way in which we thought about time basically shifted. So there was the idea like, okay, time is something which can be counted and measured by clocks and calendar, and it actually naturally moves forward. So it moves from the past to the future. So instead of, for instance, a cyclical idea of time, where time constantly moves in a circle, you get a sort of linear idea of time. So events take place on a line that basically moves forward. And this is a dominant idea in Eurocentric cultures. And this is tied to another idea of time that became dominant in modernity, which is a progressive idea of time. So with the advent of modern science, there was the idea of like, okay, we can control how the world works, we can actually figure it out. And that also means we can improve the world. So because we know we can also rely on this clock time, that is always the same, we can basically see how the world develops over the ages. And this happened to such an extent that the future also almost became identified with progress, with betterment and development. And Freeman shows in her book that the chronic is the other side of the coin. So it's actually when the situation does not progress in something better. And she states that confronts us with a difficult moment, because if we identify the future with something that gets better and something that moves on, how do we relate to a future when the situation doesn't really seem to change, when the future seems to kind of be the same as the present, when there is no development? And this is something that people with a chronic illness really struggle with. So with illness, there's often the idea or disease that we can kind of predict the workings of the body in order to come towards an endpoint of the illness. So we try to work towards getting better, and if that doesn't work, the person dies. but there is some kind of endpoint. But with a chronic disease, it is way more complex than that. And I would say that, I mean, in any disease, it's never just one specific medical thing and that's it, medical cause and that's it. There's always psychological and social factors involved. But with chronic disease, that gets more apparent. So you have all these biomedical, social, psychological issues, which makes it very difficult to actually predict what is going on. And very often we don't even know what the cause could be. And this also means that chronic illness typically does not follow a progressive arc. It does not really seem to move forward. And people with chronic illness are often caught in this really strange experience of time, wherein their body is, on one hand, really unpredictable. So I cannot really recount the times that I have to tell people, like, I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm going to make it today because I don't know if I will have pain. So it's very difficult to know what your body will be able to do the next day. But on the other hand, there's this feeling that it will be ill tomorrow again, and the day after tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. So it's unpredictable and immovable. And it's changing all the time, but it's not moving into a new situation. So how can we actually make sense of that? Something that, both moves constantly and stands still. And because in our society, we really identify the future with progression, and otherwise we find it really difficult to think, okay, what does the future then entail? Chronically ill people are often faced with like these two extreme possibilities. On one hand, there's the idea like, okay, you will have to work hard to get better. And this is the idea like, okay, there is some kind of linear time there and we can work towards a solution, and it's a very hopeful narrative. And you see that many people with a chronic illness, specifically when it's medically unexplained, go from doctor to doctor to doctor to get a diagnosis. And that's also because in our society, we really link any possible help that you could get or any financial help to like a clear diagnosis and a sort of prognosis, because we have this idea that care cannot be endless. There has to be some kind of endpoint. And then when it's apparent that maybe we cannot move towards this cure, there's the other side, which is like, you just have to learn to live with it. This is some kind of frozen time and a feeling of hopelessness. And I suggest that these two reactions are basically two sides of the same coin. So if working hard to get better towards this endpoint is basically the narrative we really hold on to, but if that doesn't work out, it kind of flips into its into the other side, the antithesis, into like, okay, there's nothing we can do here. And another difficulty is that chronic always implies some kind of failure, like a failure to heal, a failure to progress, a failure to have a future. So at the end of this presentation, I want to ask, like, okay, might there be other ways of looking at chronic illness? And I want to kind of look for stories or experience outside of this idea of hope versus hopelessness. And I think there are really a lot of ways to do this. And I'm also really curious to hear your thoughts during the discussion. And one way in which I try to think about it is through the German philosopher Helmut Plessner. And he basically said that, well, human beings are embodied beings, and they constantly have to find a new relation to their own bodies and in their own bodies. And he stated that therefore life is a never-ending problem. So we basically never know beforehand how we can live our lives, but every time there is a new situation, we kind of have to find an answer to that again. And what I find very interesting about this is that, yes, this is a never-ending problem, but it doesn't really make sense to call it chronic, because it's not a failure to progress, because we are this problem. I mean, it's not a failure if you cannot solve this problem, because you cannot really solve yourself. And Plessner emphasizes two things that I want to point out, is that firstly, there's some kind of unfathomability to our life. And he states, well, we can never fully understand how to live our lives. We can only live it. And I think that also might offer some ways of getting outside of these narratives, like either there's hope or there's hopelessness, because, you know, there is some kind of openness to human life, and you only know what it is when you actually live it, so to say. And the other point is that you can never live your life alone. So what I said at the beginning, that you just have to learn to live with it, is kind of framed as this individual task. Well, that almost makes living with the situation impossible with the same gesture, you know, like telling somebody you have to live with it, but it's your problem, kind of makes it impossible for them to live with it. And I think that this might invite us to look at concrete embodied practices, so concrete ways in which people actually deal with chronic situations. And one way, I think, is to look at caring. So I've talked a lot about medicine, medical science, specifically in relation to this like linear narrative and progressive narrative. But there are quite some studies, like I list two examples here. One is from Annemarie Mol, The Logic of Care, and the other one is from Stephanie Davis. This is her PhD thesis. And they both show that good care, and that's not only the case, by the way, in medical situations, but also, for instance, at home, is often a deviation from linearity, a deviation of moving towards a cure. And Davies, for instance, she looked at the way in which general practitioners and their patients try to deal with situations that there's just ongoing pain or ongoing fatigue, but nobody really knows what to do. And she stated, well, it was common for whole episodes to revolve around situations that patients and practitioners were unable either to change or to move on from. But she said, there was caring happening here. So there was something meaningful happening here, even if it was not always perfect and even if there was not a clear solution, but there was something meaningful. But what it was very difficult for the general practitioners to justify to their insurance companies that why they did this, because they could not really come up with like a clear solution or a clear result. And at the very end, I would like to recommend this book that I think some of you might like. It's Enduring Time by Lisa Bereitzer. And she basically looks at all kinds of embodied practices which basically involve non-progressive experiences. And one example she gives is caring. And she says, well, caring is a bit like a chronic illness. It's endlessly repeating. So you have to change diapers again and again. You have to feed again and again. You have to clean again and again. And at the same time, it's unpredictable because you never really know when your care will be needed. And she says, well, we're really used to attach meaning to a sort of endpoint we move towards. But she states, well, perhaps it is also through these arduous and repetitive experiences that we come to matter to each other. So that we actually, by doing these things over and over and by basically trying to live this situation of non-progressive pain, for instance, this is a way in which we actually start mattering as bodies. And this is what I think that I kind of want to look for embodied experience which cannot be captured either in these terms of progressive time or the other side, a failure of progressive, which we call chronic time. And maybe in that way we find new ways to live with these chronic situations. So yeah, that's the end.
Thank you very much, Femke, for this very lovely and insightful presentation that I find also a bit hopeful, or at least opening. And I hope this also applies to the others. Concerning your last point about the concrete embodied practices. When I got ill, my dog companion Ollie was very old, and he was also ill, and he had chronic pain. He had that for 3 years, back pain, and he was very good at coping. and he had his goals and his way of moving about in his life. And I thought about that so much when I was ill, and also our caring for each other. You know, I found that
Yeah.
very hopeful and inspiring. And I have more to say about this, especially from the multi-species context. Actually, I found this very inspiring, but maybe I can ask a question later. I'd now first like to ask um, the other humans here in the presentation if there's somebody who has a question, comment, experience they want to share. And as always, if you are Dutch and feel uncomfortable speaking English, please ask your question in Dutch and I will translate it. Do I see a hand by Meerte van Hout? Yes, Meerte, please.
Hi, Femke. Thanks so much for your talk. I thought it was really interesting. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Yes.
So I was listening to your talk and also researching mental health care sector in the Netherlands.
Mm-hmm.
And this is definitely something that's super interesting because I think also in mental health care, there's a lot of chronic problems.
Mm-hmm.
But I also see that there's a lot of problems with like availability of care, and we often don't really have the funds to like finance. Like a lot of people have issues like this. So how can we, like this caring as a continuous task that you talk about? Is this something that we can also build into our healthcare system, you think, or is it more something of like friends, family? Like how can you see this in the context of healthcare, or maybe it's not in healthcare at all in the end?
Yeah, that's just a really good question, and one I find very difficult to answer because this is something I did not put in my talk, but of course there is now in most of the Western countries there is this crisis of healthcare. So this, you know, this this situation that people are getting older in general, and that we have basically the quality of care. We cannot really there's a lot of waiting lists and we don't really know how to give everybody qualitative care. And this is also something you see in the mental health situations. And chronic illness is really seen as a huge contributor to that problem. And I find it really difficult to, I don't really know, like this is again like to get with a solution, but I think that it's also a way of seeing basically re-evaluating care in a way, so not only relying on care from professionals, but also seeing how care could be more of a way of living together. I don't know if this sounds very too sweet in a way, but I think that yeah, I find it very difficult because it's true that there is not always finances to basically care for these ongoing problems. And I think it really starts with basically asking each other, like, okay, what kind of society do we want to live in, and what kind of care do we want to provide to each other, And I think that is more of like a society-wide problem that we cannot only solve within this healthcare system alone. But yeah, I wouldn't know any concrete solutions, to be really honest.
Thanks. Yeah, we've spoken a lot also about neoliberalism and capitalism creating a sort of an image of the patient, but also expectations from patients in earlier sessions. And I think that would be a nice connection also to your talk, these discussions. There's one other thing that I wanted to note when I was listening to your presentation, because you speak about progressive time and the idea of getting better, and specifically with people in the PICE community, it's very clear that this makes humans actually more ill because they are expected to exercise and build up their.
Sorry, which community?
The post-viral illnesses.
Yeah.
So So I think that your claim could even be made stronger by recognizing this. I don't know how this works in the case of chronic pain, whether that's also made worse by medical professionals through following this logic of progressive time. But it's quite true for the long COVID ME type.
Yeah, there's something interesting there, that there is this idea that you have to perform the sick role in the right way, right? So when you're sick, you have to kind of show that you are a good patient and you are working towards getting better. And there are quite some studies that also show that people basically find it such almost like a second job to basically constantly show other people that they're working towards betterment. And I don't know specific studies that show that it actually makes people sicker in the case of chronic pain, but I can imagine it does, because it's this constant pressure of basically showing like, okay, I am actually taking extra steps. And I recently read this really interesting study about people with chronic pain who basically had decided to not work towards getting better, to basically accept like, okay, this is it, and I'm going to try to live my life as well as possible. And then they got a lot of reactions from people like, oh, why do you accept this? Why don't you just try to make it better? Why don't you just exercise more? And it also kind of emphasizes this idea that a life with pain or a life with fatigue or whatever kind of chronic condition you have is not really a valuable life.
Thank you. Hannah, I saw that you wanted to ask a question. Is that true?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
I was just going to comment that I think there's, like you mentioned, the post-viral community. I have ME, and I think there's this quite cruel irony when it comes to illnesses that include an energy impairment, that actually sometimes the harder you try to get better, i.e. the more things you do, the worse you become, the more severe your illness can be, because you are pushing yourself outside of your limits. And I think that's something that the medical community versus the patient groups struggle really hard to understand, is this: we're not trying hard enough, but in fact trying can make us all the more ill. And that's a really painful thing, I think, to get non-disabled or non-sick people to understand.
Yeah. Yeah.
Emily?
Yeah, so you said earlier in your talk that our notion of time shifted with modernity. And I just was wondering if you had further thoughts on sort of what the various causes were of the shift. Like why was a notion of progressive time essential in modernity? Yeah, and what was influencing or pushing that change?
Right. Yeah, I think you have this philosopher Reinhard Koselleck. He might be really interesting for you to look up. And he basically shows that it had a lot to do with like the Enlightenment and basically the advent of modern science. So the idea that, you know, you can this is also something I think I touched briefly on in my talk, like the idea that you can basically understand how the world works scientifically, and that you can basically predict these workings of the world, and therefore you can actually also make the world a better place. And the interesting thing was that before modernity there was this idea that progress had a very different meaning. So there was the idea that the more the world progressed, the older it would become. So the world was basically compared to sort of an organism, you know, the idea like, okay, the older you get, the longer you go on, you will get older, and we are basically going towards the end of the world. So there was the idea like, okay, we are basically, yeah, it was a very Christian idea, right? That the world will end at some point. And then that kind of shifted. I think Leibniz also really pointed out at some moments like, wait, maybe the world will not end. Maybe it will just keep on getting better. And then there came this crazy idea like, okay, maybe, you know, we can just get better and better and better, and there's no end to it. And then there was this truly open idea of history, like, okay, just like the sky is the limit, basically. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Thank you. There's a remark by Bas in the chat who's thanking you for your presentation, and there's a question by Ellen who's asking, I can imagine there are cultures that deal with this differently and perhaps also more appropriately. Have you looked into that? And if so, can you tell us something about how those cultures maybe deal better with chronic illness?
I honestly, this is not my specialism. So I don't really know, honestly. I think that already pointing out that the chronic is some kind of specifically Western modern idea. So I really wonder if in cultures where there is not so much a thing, if there you have this whole experience of chronicity and yeah, I wouldn't know. I would be really interested to hear if anybody does. And I think that nowadays the World Health Organization and all those other international organs, they really point out again and again and again that chronic illnesses are one of the most important issues in the world, and one of the most is the biggest cause of death, for instance, in the third world as well. So I think that nowadays the problem of chronic illness, that is a worldwide problem, is also really spreading. So I really wonder if there's also a clash there with like local cultures who might think about this differently or not. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, it might also be interesting in the context of time to, for example, look at Aboriginal cultures and folks for whom the present and the past and the future have very different roles in daily life. I'd be very interested in that. So thank you for the question, Ellen. And if somebody knows, please just jump in. Okay, Luz was raising her hand.
Yes, thank you very much, Eva. Femke, thank you for your nice presentation and your research. I think the corona has been the infectious disease which went to be chronic.
Yeah.
And we try to call it another way. We call it post-COVID or long COVID. And that's because we were very surprised that that all the symptoms were so invasive and so long during.
Yeah.
Would you plea for let's say a stopping of the word chronic, and look for other words, or do you think it's not worthwhile to make the effort to look for another symbol or another way of expressing the burden of the disease?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, because this is a question I have for myself as well. So Elizabeth Freeman, who I used in the presentation, who shows the history of the word chronic, she basically really says that the chronic is a queer figure. And by that, she means that it's a way to challenge normative ideas about time. Mm-hmm. And she goes into discussion with other scholars, and one of them, I think rightly, also points out, like, well, isn't this whole idea of the chronic not too much attached to this idea of progressive time? So does it not always imply some kind of failure of progressive time? And it's a really interesting discussion, and I always find it very difficult, right? This idea like, okay, this concept is problematic, then should we just throw it out of the window? And what does it then mean to come with a new concept? Does that actually really change anything? And I also think there's always this really interesting thing of appropriation happening. You know, even the word queer, that's also an interesting example, you know, that used to be a sort of slur, and now many people are saying, well, I'm proud to be queer, this is my identity. So I could imagine that something that could happen with the word chronic, but I also, I was even experimenting a bit with that in my presentation, that I kind of started saying long-term diseases at the end.
Yeah.
Because I was like, okay, maybe then I should also not use the word chronic anymore at the end. But I really, I'm not sure yet, actually. Yeah, this is something I'm still questioning.
Yeah, the point is also that some patients really ask for the term chronicity, because then it's real that their ill is still going on. Until now, it's you have to heal, you have to get better, as long as it is not a chronic disease, when it's not seen as a chronic disease. So that's the other point, the other side of the medal. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's also very difficult to just say, basically from your philosopher place, like, oh, this is a wrong concept, because the way in which people relate to it and use it and make sense of it is very depending on their individual situation. And I think indeed it sometimes it is a sort of relief to get this stamp, but that also says something about what I think Hannah said before. This idea that you constantly have to show that you have to work hard to get better.
Yeah.
And there's also this problem that in general, illnesses that are experienced by women or by people of color are more prone to be called chronic, because there's just not a lot of research being done. So there's also some kind of power relation there that very often also you often have this word chronic poverty, right? And that also implies, well, there's nothing we can do, it's just a helpless situation. So it can also be used as a way of saying, well, we cannot do any more research here, we cannot do anything for you.
So that's very bad. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I see that Edna wants to ask a question very briefly in response to the last, before last question, a comment by Emily, who's writing North American indigenous cultures almost unanimously have a circular conception of time, which is closely related to an ethics of non-exploitation of the land, animals, and people. Thanks, Emily, for mentioning that to us. And I think it's also a very beautiful opening to dive into later, perhaps after this session. It's at least something that I would want to know more about in relation to chronic illness and caring. So thanks for giving me that idea, Femke and Emily. Edna, you are also raising your hand and want to ask a question. Please go.
Thank you so much for this possibility and the presentation. Very interesting, the time concept. And I just want to comment indeed on the cultural aspect of the context and the how people perceive the chronic term, like also in other cultures. I'm born and raised in Western Europe, Paris, and living as from my first year in the Netherlands. In African cultures, like the burnout, what is that? Burnout is really a Western term of what is burnout? I saw recently a reportage on NPO, and there was this African person who said, a burnout, he really laughed at it. So what does it mean, burnout? We really care about each other. We are a community. We care for each other. And I personally have a friend who's is really affected by long COVID already for 2 to 3 years. And I just want to care. I want to help, and then I'm like in the center, I think, of that coin of maybe being perceived as hopelessly naive, that I'm hopeful. But in the end, it is just like that I am falling too short, because he doesn't know what effect it will be if I would be able to in practice care for him, that it would be then too much, that I will actually deteriorate his situation. And so the planning forward is like so uncertain that if it would be like impacting him, so that would be that negatively. So that would be the last thing that I would want to do. So in effect, how can I help and care with the perception of nowadays in the community, in the society, that if I would help, that would be hopelessly naive, or that he's then afraid of being or asking for help, or even the situation wouldn't even allow him for me to care. So it is like in a split that I'm in.
Yeah. 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 So
my hands are tied in the sense, and I am not even asking, or you guys. I mean, I have totally so much respect for you, but it is just like, how can I, as a non-long COVID patient, help in a sense without having, to fall you short on, because, I went on holiday and I said, well, in a wave of hope. Yeah, next time you will come and just a few meters that you need to walk. But with all that perception, it came too hard on him.
Mm-hmm.
And it is just like being hopeful, but in the end, I'm totally not naive. I'm reading and I see how the government is acting. I see the Western thing going on, but in myself, I'm just like being taunt.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that there's a lot of talk in care ethics about these difficulties, that I mean, we really associate care also often with a sort of harmony, you know, like in a way in which like two people find a way of caring for each other. But there's a lot of conflict and a lot of difficulties, and it's often very painful, and it's often very tiresome, and it's often very difficult to know how to be there for the other person. And
Yeah,
it can be
but
very frustrating as well. So I think that it there is some kind of I think it's very important to also, as when you try to care for someone, kind of make space for that feeling as well. And I think that
that is far too important. It's very important indeed. That is indeed what people need to understand, in the fact, to give the space, because the voorspelbaarheid,
mm-hmm.
predictability is also for that one person. Yeah, I mean, it is just, very difficult.
Yeah,
Very difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Edna. What I could maybe add, coming from the long COVID situation myself, is that it's very, I couldn't really handle care from others because it was just too much.
Exactly.
You know,
It's too
people
much.
they want to
You
speak to
cannot
you, and even having the bodies in your house, and I mean, even somebody delivering the groceries to the front door. You
exactly
need to
that.
stand up,
It's
you
too
need to
much.
speak to them. And especially when it's a friend or a family member, they're also worried. So then you need to deal with their worries. For example, my mother was worried a lot, and this just made me more nervous and
exactly. You're not waiting for that. So that I
difficult.
fully understand that.
So communicating about it, I think, is very important. So asking someone what kind of help they want, and doing that, but also simply, what's really great is to know that people don't forget you. So just send a text message. Sometimes send a postcard. Postcards are great because they're not very harmful, and the message is short. And it's not. I had problems also with email and WhatsApp and all of these things. But yeah, postcards are good, and just show you care. And
that is the only thing that you can do in practice.
Yeah.
But in that sense, what can you do more in the sense of
and
not
sometimes
burden that person?
Yeah.
But I recently the last session about activism. I mean, what can I do apart from having to contact him in that sense, or her, or any one of you, just collectively to try to do something.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot. And I know that activism is a hot topic in these circles as well. So I'm sure that we will discuss this a bit more. I'm just looking at the clock because it's 10 to 8.
Thank you.
I'm seeing a couple of recommendations in the chat. So Hannah Turner wrote about an essay by Ellen Samuel on 6 ways of looking at crib time. I recall that in the first session we also spoke about crib time. So there's a website, and you can click on that and read the article. Lee Phillips recommends the book Care Work by Leah Lakshmi Krishna Samarasinya. And Hannah Turner also thinks this is a great book. So I think that we definitely need to read these books. I would like to ask you all if there's somebody who has a last question for Femke, or a last comment perhaps, or a message to...
Maybe I can suggest something.
Yes?
Yes. Maybe I can speak in Dutch if you translate. Yes. Ik was wel getriggerd door de opmerking dat het ook een relief kan zijn, een opluchting kan zijn, de term chronisch. Omdat als je weet dat je ziek bent en je weet ook dat het chronisch is, dan kan je ook tot een soort acceptatie komen van je situatie. En ook dan heel erg je dankbaar voelen dat je er überhaupt bent. Still going on. En dat je ook alle warmte en liefde en aandacht heel erg kan waarderen, omdat het je blij maakt. Dus chronisch is in mijn beleving dan niet alleen maar negatief, maar het kan, hoeft niet, maar het kan eventueel ook nog deze positieve aspecten hebben.
Yeah. Can I answer?
Just to briefly sum up, Aukje said that chronic can also bring a relief, as Femke also discussed in her presentation, and can also be a positive experience for the person who's ill.
Yeah.
Well, that's...
Yeah, no, I think that, people deal with this whole word of chronic in very different ways, for sure. And I do think that for some, when you are constantly thinking, as we said before, that this idea of, okay, I have to heal and heal and heal myself and work towards betterment, sometimes it can actually be like, okay, maybe it won't get better, but I'm just still here and I'm trying to just make the situation as livable as possible. And I'm also sometimes wondering if, because the word chronic always implies that it's something bad, that this disease is there, that maybe in that way it might also be a sort of burden. I think it really depends. And I think this one word that you said is acceptance. And I think what is very interesting is, I just read this book, Welcome in the Kingdom of this, Welkom in het Rijk der Zieken van Hannah Barefoot. It's about someone who has a post-viral syndrome as well. It's the, how do you say, post-Q fever?
Q fever, yeah.
Yeah, and basically the whole book, he cannot accept that it will be chronic, right? So he just constantly works towards a cure. And at the end of the book, he's kind of confronted, like, okay, you have to accept you will never get better. And I do think that this acceptance can be a relief and can open up more possibilities. But what is very interesting is that very often in books about illness, it's a sort of the end of the book that the person goes like, oh, now I accept it. And it often implies that, okay, well, then we cannot end the illness, so there will not be an endpoint there, but at least there will be an endpoint in acceptance. And I think that's also very interesting, that is a way in which in these literary stories, there is still this idea of, okay, now there's an endpoint and now there's acceptance. And it kind of assumes that there is this stable state of acceptance that somebody can reach, whereas typical about chronic illness is that it keeps on being disruptive. So you will never find one way of dealing with it. And I think, so I
do agree. I do agree.
Yeah, I always think it's like, that's so difficult about this whole thing, that it's such a balancing act, right? Like I think that, okay, this acceptance, it can really help, but it also shouldn't be interpreted as this absolute endpoint. So it's really, I'm really juggling with words sometimes, but I really see what you mean. Yeah.
And I think, well, this enjoying the little happy moments, they are not being little happy moments, but they can grow to bigger happy moments. Het kleine momenten kunnen groter worden, doordat je die dankbaarheid ook ervaart dat je het mag beleven.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
Nou, dat was toch even mijn positieve inbreng
At the
hier.
end, like try to make it a positive story.
Nou ja, het zat bij mij toch wel dat ik dat toch wel wou inbrengen als iets wat in mijn beleving wel domineert.
Yeah. Thank you.
Ja.
Thank you, Aukje. I don't know if there are other questions. Boudewijn Krijger in the chat said, Aukje, you nailed it. So he agrees with you, Aukje. If there are no other final questions or comments, then I would very much like to thank Femke for speaking here today. So please give Femke an applause. And I also forgot to mention in the introduction that Femke writes for Philosophy magazine. So the Dutch people in this room can read that and read her work. And we are all, I think, eagerly waiting for your PhD thesis now, and also articles about this topic, because it's really important and interesting, and I think it gave us a lot of things to think about, and also some not hope, but an opening. And I think that that's really something that we needed in these conversations as well. So thanks for that, Femke. The next meeting will be in a month exactly, on the 4th of March, by H.M. Okan, who will speak about reading Adam Smith as an antidote to long COVID misery. So I hope to see you all there, and thanks a lot for your participation tonight, and especially Femke, of course.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for the interesting questions and comments. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. See you next time.
Thank you very much.
Well done.